You want to know how I ended up guarding a princess? Start with the cell. Not a bad cell, honestly, not by Kelvara 9 standards. They gave me a bunk, actual foam padding, not the recycled mesh most of the lower-tier detainees got. A ration slot that opened twice a day. A gravity panel on the floor that kept me from floating into the ceiling during the station's low-G maintenance cycles. By interstellar prison standards, I'd read worse in the files. I'd seen worse. I'd been in worse back before the unit, before the collapse of the Terran Forward contract, before everything went sideways at Mara Station. But a comfortable cell is still a cell. My name is Darian Moss. I was 31 years old at the time of the events I'm about to describe. I'm going to be honest with you. Completely honest. Because the archive needs the truth, and because I'm tired of the version of this story that's been circulating in the tabloid feeds, the one where I'm some kind of war hero who volunteered for duty out of loyalty to the Galactic Accord. That's not what happened. What happened was stranger than that, and simpler, and a lot more violent than the official report lets on. Let me go back to the cell. I'd been in Kelvara 9 for 3 weeks by the time any of this started. 3 weeks of recycled air that tasted like old metal and something vaguely biological that I'd decided not to think about too hard. 3 weeks of watching the guard shift cycle through the corridor outside my reinforced viewport, Vethani security officers in their slate-gray exoskeletal armor, moving in pairs, never speaking to the prisoners. The Vethani didn't speak much at all. They communicated in subsonic pulses that the translation nodes in the station walls converted into text on your bunk's info panel. Even their orders came in text. Remain seated. Lights off in 30 seconds. Meal distribution in 6 minutes. It was eerie, like living inside a very polite machine. My crime, well, they called it interference with sanctioned commerce in a controlled zone. What that actually meant was that I'd gotten into a firefight with a Vethani enforcement contractor at Mara Station who was about to execute 3 unarmed human dock workers over an invoice dispute. The invoice was for 14,000 galactic credit units. The 3 dock workers were named Priya, Fen, and a kid everyone called Boots because his actual name was something like Beaumont, and no one could say it right when they were panicking. I shot the contractor's weapon arm off. He was a Gorathi, big, 4-armed bioceramic plating under his skin. The arm grew back, mostly. The contractor's employer, Vethani Logistics and Security combined, filed a claim against me for destruction of property, interference with lawful enforcement, and what their attorneys called willful disregard of interspecies commerce doctrine. The Terran colonial government, in its infinite courage, declined to contest the claim on my behalf because Vethani Logistics and Security combined held the contract for 3 of their asteroid mining operations. So, 3 weeks in a cell, waiting for a tribunal that my lawyer, a Vethani defense-assigned translator whose name rendered in standard as something like clerk who processes disputes amicably, assured me would result in either a significant fine or a labor indenture contract of between 2 and 5 standard years. I was not in a good mood. And then they brought the princess. I heard her before I saw her. Not her voice exactly. It was the sound of the corridor changing, the footsteps. There were always footsteps in the outer corridor, the rhythmic double step of the Vethani patrols, sometimes the shuffle of a maintenance worker, occasionally the heavy clank of the armor-suited inspectors who came through on station days. I'd memorized them all in the way you memorize sounds when you have nothing else to do. It was something my sergeant had drilled into us during training at the Fort Vance facility back on Earth. You want to know when something's wrong? Learn what normal sounds like first. Really learn it. The way a musician learns silence. Sergeant Calloway, another story for another day. The sounds in the corridor changed around 300 station time. I know the time because the bunk's info panel was showing it when I snapped awake. I've always been a light sleeper, another gift from the unit. 1 second I was under, and then my body just sat up. Muscle memory, something was different. More footsteps, heavier. Not the Vethani double step, but something with a different cadence, a different weight distribution. And underneath it, something else, a very faint sound, almost like wind chimes, except there was no wind in the station corridor, and those definitely weren't chimes. It was something biological, something in the upper registers of hearing, almost at the edge. I got off the bunk and moved to the viewport. The viewport was a horizontal slit about 8 centimeters tall and 30 wide, reinforced transparency polymer, set into the door at roughly eye level for a human, which meant it was at roughly shoulder level for the Vethani guards, which meant they generally didn't bother looking in through it. I'd positioned my bunk against the far wall specifically so I could watch the corridor through the slit without being obviously visible from outside. Old habit. Through the viewport, I saw them. There were 6 Vethani officers in the corridor, which was already unusual. The standard patrol was 2. All 6 were in full formal armor, the kind with the raised shoulder configurations that indicated command-level rank. Walking between 4 of them, with the other 2 ahead and behind, was a figure I didn't recognize. She wasn't Vethani. That was obvious from the first second. The Vethani are big, 2.5 meters on average, broad-shouldered, with the pale gray chitinous exterior that their exoskeletal structure produces. This figure was taller than me, which put her at roughly 180 centimeters, and she was built along lines that were almost humanoid in proportion. Almost. But not quite. Her skin, or what I initially thought was skin, was doing something that skin doesn't normally do. It was shifting. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested shape-shifting or anything like that. More like the surface of still water when something moves beneath it. Patterns of bioluminescence, very faint, moving through her in slow waves. Blue, then a kind of deep violet, then blue again. Her hair, and it was hair, I was almost certain, though it moved with a slight independent quality that suggested it might also have some sensory function, was dark and long, and it caught the corridor light in ways that ordinary hair doesn't. She was wearing what I later learned was a traveling suit, formal enough for diplomatic transit, functional enough for comfort on a station. It was dark material, close-fitting, with structures at the shoulders and wrists that I would eventually learn were sensor arrays woven into the fabric. At her throat was something that glowed with a low, steady light, like a coal that never quite went out. She walked with her head up. That's the thing I remember most clearly. Most people, when they're being moved through a prison facility, even if they're not prisoners themselves, even if they're just visiting or being escorted, most people have a slight downward tilt to their head. It's instinctive. The environment affects you. The fluorescent lighting, the sound of locks, the smell of recycled air and institutional cleaning solution, it presses down on you. She walked with her head up like the corridor was her corridor, like she was doing the station a favor by walking through it. I watched until they turned the corner and the sound of the extra footsteps faded. Then I stood at the viewport for a long time in the dark, thinking. In the morning, the information came through the bunk panel as a text notification. Station Directive 7 Alpha, restricted wing designation enacted, corridor B7 through B9. Civilian and non-essential personnel movement suspended. Duration, indefinite. Station Commander VTHOSARA. And then 2 hours later, a second notification. Detainee Moss, DU are requested to present yourself for administrative review at 1100 station time. Escort will be provided. Administrative block, KELVARA 9. Administrative review, for a detainee who wasn't even scheduled for a tribunal hearing for another 6 weeks. At 1100, which was less than 2 hours away. I sat on the bunk and thought about that for a while. They sent 2 guards, not the standard one. 2, both in the raised shoulder command armor, both carrying the elongated shock lances that the Vethani used for high-priority transfers. They were perfectly polite in the Vethani way, meaning, they sent a text to my panel 5 minutes before they arrived telling me to stand facing the door with my hands visible. And then they opened the door and gestured me out without actually making eye contact or speaking. The administrative block was in the opposite direction from B7 through B9. I noticed that, and then I noticed that we weren't going to the administrative block. We turned twice, went through 2 security checkpoints where the guard's armor interfaced directly with the door systems in a way that bypassed the usual vocal confirmation protocols, and ended up in a section of the station I'd never been in, cleaner than the detainee corridors. The lighting was warmer, less of the institutional blue-white, more of something that sat in the amber range. The floors were a different material, something with a slight give to it that absorbed footsteps. On the walls were what I first took for decorative elements, raised geometric patterns, but looking at them as we walked, I realized they were actively shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the woman I'd seen in the corridor. The guard stopped outside a door. Not a cell door, a proper door, the kind with a frame and a handle equivalent and an access panel that was clearly more sophisticated than anything in the detainee block. One of them put their hand against the access panel. The door opened. They stood aside. I looked at the open door, then at the guards, then back at the door. The guard on my left sent a text to my wrist panel. They'd given me a temporary comm band for the escort. Apparently, that read, "You may enter." So I entered. The room was large by station standards. It had been configured as a sitting room of some kind. There were pieces of furniture that I didn't entirely recognize, shapes that were functional but not quite calibrated to human proportions. A long, low surface that might have been a table, with objects on it that I didn't examine closely because my attention went immediately to the far side of the room. She was standing at the viewport. A real viewport in this section, not the slit I had in my cell, but a full panel of transparency, looking out into the starfield. Kelvara 9 was positioned at the edge of a nebula formation, one of the arms of the Veth cluster, and from this viewport the view was extraordinary. Layers of light, color like paint left to drift in water, stars behind it all like someone had pressed diamonds into velvet. She was watching the stars when I came in, and she didn't turn around immediately. I stopped just inside the door. The door closed behind me. The two guards were outside. I waited. After about 30 seconds, she turned around. Up close, she was more striking than she'd been in the corridor. The bioluminescence wasn't constant. It moved with her breath, very subtly, or with her attention. When she turned and looked at me, there was a brief pulse of something blue-white under her skin, there and gone in a second, like a thought you almost catch. Her eyes were large. Not outrageously, not in a cartoonish way, but large enough that the proportion read as different from human, and the irises were a color that I couldn't name then and still struggle to name now. The closest I can get is the color that happens in the moment between a lightning flash and darkness, that electric instant, and they moved differently from human eyes. Not the movement exactly, but the attention behind the movement. When she looked at me, she looked at all of me at once, like a camera with no focal length preference. She said something in Ethan. Then she tilted her head slightly. The translation node embedded in the room's wall rendered a delay, and then the standard came through. "You are the one who removed the arm of the Gorathi contractor at Myra Station." Not a question, a statement. I said yes. Another pulse of bioluminescence, this one warmer, something in the amber gold range. "He was going to kill the dock workers over a debt," she said. "A debt of 14,000 GCU the workers could not pay." "That's correct," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "My name is Thessaly Vi Ethan. I am the third daughter of the Ethan Sovereign Compact. I have been assigned to this station for a period of diplomatic residence while my father's court negotiates a trade agreement with the Vethani Commerce Directorate. This is a polite way of saying that I am here as a political gesture, and that I am expected to remain here and be visible and cooperative while the actual negotiations occur elsewhere, and that I am surrounded by people whose loyalty to me is conditional on outcomes I cannot predict." She said this with a completely level expression. "I need a guard," she said, "a personal guard. Someone who sleeps outside my door and stands inside it during public functions, and who is not connected to any of the parties currently negotiating over my family's economic future." I said nothing. I was doing the math. "You are a prisoner in this facility," she said. "You have no political connections. You have no financial stake in the Ethan Vethani trade agreement. You have demonstrated willingness to cause serious physical harm to a significantly larger and biologically superior opponent in defense of individuals who could offer you nothing in return." She paused. "I find these qualities useful," she said. "I want to be clear about something, because the archive record needs this part accurately." I did not say yes immediately. I am aware that in some of the subsequent reporting on these events, the narrative has been shaped to suggest that I immediately and heroically agreed to serve as the princess's guard out of some instinct for justice or duty. That's not accurate. What actually happened is that I stood there for a solid minute running through every way this could go wrong, every possible trap in the offer, every angle from which this situation could become worse than a Kelvara 9 detainment. The angles I identified. 1. This could be a setup by the Vethani logistics contractor. Send someone to recruit me into a position close to a diplomatic figure. Wait for me to do something that could be used against me in tribunal. Upgrade my charges from interference with commerce to diplomatic incident, which carried significantly more serious consequences. 2. The princess could be legitimate, and the threat she was implying could also be legitimate. in which case I was being recruited to put myself between an alien royal and whatever was moving against her. With no equipment, no backup, no legal standing, and no guarantee that surviving the experience would actually change my legal status. 3. There was no 3. When I tried to construct a third angle, I kept coming back to the dock workers. Priya, Fen, Boots. I said, "What happens to my detainment status?" She said, "I have spoken with Station Commander Vethasara. Your detainment is suspended for the duration of your service as my guard. The suspension is not a pardon. Your tribunal hearing remains on schedule. However, it removes you from the cell, gives you access to the wing designated for my use, and provides you with." She hesitated for just a moment. "Basic equipment appropriate to a personal protection role." I said, "Define basic." She told me. I said yes. Part 2, the wing. The B7 through B9 wing had been configured for an Ethan diplomatic residence, which meant that the Vethani station crew had done their best to adapt a functional prison wing to Ethan environmental preferences, with results that were mixed but genuinely impressive in their effort. The bioluminescent panels that had been installed along the walls were real Ethan import, not replicas. They shifted in the same slow wave-like patterns I'd seen on the princess's skin, and they were tuned, she told me, to a frequency that her biology found comfortable. The temperature was 3 degrees cooler than the standard station setting, which was actually closer to what humans prefer, so I wasn't complaining. The air had been processed through a secondary filter system that added trace compounds. I never learned exactly what they were, but the air smelled cleaner than anything I'd breathed since before Mara Station, like something just after rain. My post was a small room adjacent to the princess's main quarters. Not inside, she'd made that clear with polite but firm specificity. Adjacent. The door between the two rooms had a one-way alert system. If anything triggered the perimeter sensors in her room, an alarm would sound in mine. The door could be opened from my side in under 2 seconds. She had a separate exterior entrance to her quarters that ran through the main corridor. My room had its own door to the same corridor. On the first night, she showed me the layout herself, walking me through it, explaining where the sensor nodes were, where the weak points were, where the ventilation channels ran and how large they were, and whether a being of various sizes could fit through them. "You've thought about this a lot," I said. She was examining a ventilation grill with a small handheld scanner, her own equipment, not the station's, and she didn't look up. "I have 2 older sisters who have both survived assassination attempts. I have 2 brothers who have not." "Yes," she said. "I have thought about this." I didn't say anything after that, just kept noting the layout. The equipment she'd arranged for me was not exactly what I was used to. There was a shock baton, standard security issue Vethani made, the kind their officers carried. Heavy, reliable, with a variable output from uncomfortable to unconscious in under a second. I'd used equivalents before, no problem. There was a close-range pulse emitter, smaller, about the size of a large handgun, with a beam that would disrupt any electronic systems within a 5-meter radius. Useful, limited. The charge held for about 40 shots. There was a set of light tactical plating, not full armor, nothing like the exoskeletal systems the Vethani wore, but layered composite panels that fastened over a jumpsuit and covered the torso, upper arms, and thighs. It was Ethan-made. I later learned it was significantly more advanced than it looked. The composite was rated to stop most standard-issue sidearm rounds from the common species military catalogs and would distribute the impact from heavier weapons rather than absorbing it directly. And there was a blade. She handed it to me herself on the second day with a particular kind of deliberateness that I recognized as significant even before I understood why. It was a fixed-blade knife in a plain sheath, human standard length, about 23 centimeters of blade, double-edged, with a handle that fit a human hand like it had been measured for one, because it had. The handle was wrapped in something that wasn't quite leather but had the same warmth and grip in the hand, and inlaid along the spine of the blade, almost too fine to see, was a line of Ethan's script. I asked what it said. She said, "There is an old Ethan phrase. It translates approximately as, 'The small blade that moves quickly is worth more than the large weapon that hesitates.' My mother gave one to each of her children when we came of age. That one is mine. I am lending it to you." I looked at the blade. I looked at her. I said, "You're lending me your personal weapon." I am lending it to the person who is standing between me and whatever is in this station, she said. Which is you, so yes. I fastened the sheath to my belt. She watched me do it. That amber gold pulse moved through her again. Don't lose it, she said. I'll try not to. She had a staff. 4 beings, not counting me. A personal attendant named Sira, Ethan, small and quick, with bioluminescence that tended toward green, who handled the princess's daily logistics, communications, and what I gathered was some kind of medical monitoring function. A data specialist named Vorn, who was not Ethan, but rather a species I hadn't encountered before, roughly humanoid, with a faint phosphorescent quality to his gray skin and eyes that were completely white, except for a very fine dark line for a pupil. He worked exclusively on a portable computational system that he carried in a case that never left his hands. A protocol officer named Ilya Vethani, assigned by the station, officially a liaison but functionally present to report on the princess's activities to Station Commander Vethasara. And a second personal guard, an Ethan named Kale, who had been with the princess's household for years and who looked at me from the very first moment, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not friendly, measuring. Kale was taller than me by about 15 centimeters, broader. The bioluminescent patterns on his skin were different from the princess's, slower, steadier, cooler in color, more blue than anything else. His equipment was significantly more sophisticated than mine. Full Ethan tactical armor, a weapons complement I was not entirely able to catalog from what I could see, and the kind of stillness in his movement that you only get from years of doing one specific kind of work very seriously. On the first night after the princess had retired, he came and stood in the doorway of my room. I was sitting on my bunk, an actual bunk, better than the cell, and I looked up. He said in very clean standard, "You fought a Gorathi contractor, unarmed." I had a dock worker's plasma cutter, I said. It wasn't great as a weapon, but it worked well enough. He said, the Gorathi have subcutaneous bioceramic plating equivalent to most standard round types. Standard plasma cutter output is insufficient to penetrate at maximum setting. How did you remove the arm? I said I didn't aim for the plating. He looked at me for a moment. Where did you aim? The joint, I said. The shoulder joint. The plating doesn't cover the joint fully. It would restrict movement if it did. There's a gap in the plating about 3 centimeters wide on the medial side. You have to know where to look and you have to be fast because the range of movement means the gap opens and closes as they move. When the gap was open, I put the cutter on maximum against it and held it. Kale was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, that would require you to allow the Gorathi to reach you. He had 4 arms, I said. I was already in reach whether I wanted to be or not. Another silence, longer this time. Get some sleep, he said, and he went back to his post. I want to tell you something about those first 3 days, before everything happened. They were strange. Strange in a way I hadn't expected, because I'd been braced for tension, obvious tension, the kind you can track and respond to. An environment that felt dangerous. Interactions that set off alarm signals. I'd been in protective details before, back in the unit, and they'd all had a particular quality to them, a constant low-level vibration of alertness. Everyone knowing that the threat was somewhere out there and might arrive at any time. This was different. On the surface, it looked like a diplomatic residence. The princess had meetings, formal, scheduled, with Vethani Commerce Directorate officials who came through in their formal armor and spoke in subsonic pulses, while the translation nodes converted everything to text on the display screens. She was composed in these meetings, attentive. She asked precise questions and gave careful answers, and nothing in her face or her bioluminescent patterns suggested that she found any of it dangerous. But she never went anywhere without Kale on her left and me on her right. And Kale never relaxed. I could tell because of the bioluminescence. It was the same steady blue when he was in active guard mode, always the same shade, the same slow pulse rate. He used it deliberately, I realized by the second day. The bioluminescence was partly involuntary, tied to his autonomic systems, but Ethan could also modulate it consciously. Kale kept his modulated to neutral. It was a discipline, like keeping your face still. The princess's patterns were harder to read, or maybe I just didn't have the vocabulary for them yet. On the 3rd evening, after the day's meetings had concluded, and the Vethani officials had departed, she sat in the main room of the residence with a cup of something warm and a document reader and didn't appear to be doing anything in particular. I was at my post by the corridor door. Cale was at his post near the secondary entrance. She looked up from the reader and said, "Corporal Moss." "Yes. What are you thinking about?" I said, "I'm thinking about the ventilation grill in the northeast corner of this room, the one behind the panel. The scanner you used showed a clear channel, but the angle on the channel means that a being of up to approximately 140 centimeters could navigate it with some difficulty, but could manage it. I'm thinking about whether the station's manifest includes anyone who fits that profile and has been in this section of the station in the last 48 hours. She looked at me for a moment, the bioluminescence a slow amber. "Cale," she said without looking at him, "did you think of the ventilation grill?" From his position by the secondary entrance, Cale said, "No." "Neither did I," she said. She looked back at her document reader. "Corporal Moss, in the morning before the first meeting, I would like you to walk me through every physical vulnerability in this wing that you've identified, all of them." "That'll take a while," I said. "I have time," she said. "I am a political gesture on a space station. I have a great deal of time." Part 3, the first night. It happened on the fourth night. I'm going to tell you this part carefully because it matters that I get it right. Not because I'm trying to make myself look good. If anything, the sequence of events is not entirely flattering to my readiness, if we're being honest about it. I was asleep when it started. Cale was the one who was awake. But let me back up. The afternoon of the fourth day, something changed. I noticed it the way I notice sounds in a corridor as a shift in the baseline, not a specific event. The Vethani protocol officer, Ilya, came through at her usual time for the afternoon liaison check, but she was 7 minutes late, which had never happened in 3 days of dead-on punctuality. She made no reference to it. Her demeanor was the same as always, cool, formal, textual in the Vethani communication style. But 7 minutes was a deviation. Then Vorn, the data specialist, spent 2 hours in the late afternoon in his room with the door closed, which he also never did. His door was always open, not wide, but cracked enough to see him at his portable system. On the fourth afternoon, the door was fully closed for 2 hours, and when it opened, he came out and went directly to the princess and spoke to her quietly for about 4 minutes. She listened. She asked one question. He answered. She thanked him, and he went back to his room. I watched all of this from my post. After Vorn had gone, I crossed the room to where the princess was sitting. Cale's eyes tracked me as I moved, not threateningly, just cataloging. "What did he say?" I asked. She looked at me. The bioluminescence was doing something I hadn't seen before, a very slow, deep pulse in the blue-violet range, almost at the edge of visible light. Something that, if I'd had to assign an emotion to it based on the way I'd seen similar patterns in humans, I would have called controlled fear. "He intercepted a communication," she said. "Encrypted on the station's secondary relay channel. The encryption was Vethani standard military grade, not commercial. It was fragmentary, he only got pieces. But the pieces included a timeline reference and a location reference. The location reference was a wing designation. I already knew which wing. B7 through B9, I said. She nodded, a slow movement. The timeline reference was tonight's station date. I said, "Cale." He was already moving. We spent the next 4 hours preparing. 4 hours is both a long time and not very long, depending on what you're preparing for. We didn't know exactly what was coming, which is the worst operational condition to be in. We had a location, our wing, and a timeline, tonight, and a fragmentary communication that suggested organized intent. We didn't know how many, we didn't know their species or capabilities. We didn't know whether they were going to come through the main corridor or the secondary entrance or the ventilation channels, or in some configuration I hadn't considered. What we had was the wing, the space we knew. I walked every centimeter of it again. Cale walked it with me. We didn't talk much. He was doing his own assessment, I was doing mine, and we were smart enough to wait until we'd both finished before comparing. When we compared, we agreed on 6 primary vulnerability points. We disagreed on one. He thought the main corridor door was the most likely entry point, given the corridor access limitations that would funnel any attacker through it. I thought the ventilation system, specifically the northeast corner grill and its connection to the secondary maintenance channel, was the more likely point given what I'd established about the dimensions. We didn't have time to argue about it. We moved the princess into the interior of the residence, the room with no exterior walls, the room I'd identified on the first day as the most defensible position in the wing. Sierra came with her. Vorn stayed in his room. He was more useful at his system than in a fight, and his room was in the most interior part of the wing's layout. We told Ilya, the Vethani protocol officer, that there was a security concern and that the princess's quarters were on precautionary lockdown. Ilya blinked at me with those large, compound eyes and sent a text to her own comm system. I watched where it went, to Station Commander Vethasara's office channel. I noted that. Kale took the secondary entrance. I took the main corridor door and the northeast corner of the main room. And then we waited. 2300 station time. Nothing. Zero. Nothing. The station went through its low-G maintenance cycle. 5 minutes where the gravity panels cycled down and everything got just a little bit lighter. Nothing moved. I kept my weight centered, stayed loose in my knees, watched the northeast grill. 1:30. Something moved in the ventilation channel. I felt it before I heard it. A change in the air pressure, subtle, very subtle, the kind of thing that your body registers before your conscious mind catches up. A shift in the current from the grill. And then, underneath the ambient hum of the station's environmental systems, a sound. The very faint sound of something moving with deliberate care through a narrow space. I didn't move toward the grill. I moved to the side of it. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened next, and I need you to understand that everything I'm describing occurred in approximately 11 seconds. The grill came out. It didn't fall, it was pushed out from inside, carefully, with a control that suggested the being doing it had done this before. It came out and was caught, and then the being came through the gap. The first thing I registered was the size, 130 centimeters, maybe 135, which confirmed my assessment of the channel dimensions. The second thing was the weapon in its hand, which was a blade, curved, elongated, with a quality to the edge that suggested molecular sharpening. The third thing was the fact that there were 2 more coming out of the channel behind it. The first one landed and came up fast, turning toward the interior of the room, toward where the princess's quarters were in the inner section, and it moved with the confidence of something that expected to be alone in the room. It was not alone in the room. I hit it with the shock baton on the maximum setting at close range, which is not a subtle approach, but subtlety was not the operational priority. The baton connected with its upper body, and it went down hard, the weapon clattering away, the being's system shutting down with the electromagnetic pulse that the Vethani designed the baton to deliver. 1. The second one was already out of the channel, and it had seen me hit the first one. It didn't hesitate, fast, controlled movement, the blade coming up. I sidestepped and put the pulse emitter in its face and discharged it. The electronics in the blade, it had a powered edge. I hadn't seen that in the dark, went dead, and so did everything else electronic on the being within 5 meters, including 3 separate pieces of equipment I hadn't even known it was carrying. It had 1 organic reaction left. It came at me with the now-dead blade anyway, because some things are just trained responses, and I used the Ethan knife that the princess had lent me to stop that. The blade went into the joint. Different joint than a Gorathi, but the principle applies everywhere. The places where the armor doesn't cover are always where the being needs to move, and the places where the being moves are always where it's vulnerable. 2. The third one had stayed in the channel. I could hear it not moving forward, not retreating, waiting. Waiting for what I wasn't sure. I stepped back from the grill, keeping my angle, keeping the baton ready. The pulse emitter was down to 30-something shots. The third one came out fast and low, trying to get beneath my guard. It almost worked. I took an elbow in the ribs that told me I was going to have an interesting bruise collection in the morning, and I got the baton around in a short swing that connected with something that felt like a combination of hard material and something softer underneath. 3. All 3 were down. I was breathing hard, standing in the dark with the northeast grill hanging open behind me, and 3 beings on the floor and my elbow aching from where the third one had gotten through. And then from across the wing, from the direction of the secondary entrance, I heard Kale. I don't have a precise count on how long Kale's encounter lasted. I was occupied with my own. But when I moved through the wing 10 minutes later, after I'd confirmed all three in my section were subdued and secured with the restraint cuffs I'd kept in my belt pouch from the Vethani equipment cache, Kale was standing in the secondary entrance corridor with his armor showing impact patterns across the torso plating and two more beings secured on the ground behind him. 5 total. He looked at me. The bioluminescence was doing something I hadn't seen before, a very rapid cycling through several colors, none of them holding for more than a second. I would later learn that this was the Ethan equivalent of what humans look like just after an adrenaline spike, when everything catches up at once. He said, "Northeast corner grill." "Yeah," I said. Three. He looked at his 2, secondary entrance 2. I said 5. He said 5. We looked at each other across the corridor. "The main door," I said. "How's the main door?" He checked his system. "No breach, sensors show negative." The main corridor door that he'd thought was the primary vulnerability, intact. He looked at me, I looked at him. He said, "You were right about the grill." "You were right to cover the secondary," I said. "They split." He looked at the 2 on the ground behind him. Then he looked at me again. The bioluminescence was slowing, evening out. "Yes," he said, "they did." Part 4, the morning. Station Commander Vethasara arrived at the wing at 2:45, with 6 officers and an investigative unit. I want to describe the commander for the record, because the commander is relevant to how the subsequent events unfolded. Vethasara was old, by Vethani standards, which I couldn't calibrate precisely, but the coloration of their chitinous exterior was darker and more varied than the younger officers, suggesting significant age. They wore the administrative configuration of armor rather than the security configuration, lighter, with different shoulder marking, and they moved with the careful precision of someone who had been doing this work for a very long time. They stood in the main room of the wing and looked at the grill, at the 3 secured individuals on the floor, and then at me. "In text, you subdued these 3 individuals." "With assistance from Kale on the secondary entrance," I said. "He took 2, I took 3, 5 total." "These are Vethani citizens," came the text. "Members of a registered security contractor organization." "Which contractor?" I asked. A pause. Vethasara looked at me, then at the 3 on the floor, then back at me. "Vethani Logistics and Security combined," the text came. I said, "Interesting." The commander looked at me for a long moment. The compound eyes were hard to read. Vethani faces didn't carry expression in the way human faces did, but there was something in the stillness of it. A recalibration. "Where is the princess?" "Safe," I said. "Interior quarters. I'll take you to her when you're ready." Another pause, then, "Corporal Moss, you have no operational authority on this station. Your detainment status, THOUGH suspended, does not grant you security clearance to conduct." "With respect, Commander," I said. 5 beings from a company that is currently in legal dispute with me entered the diplomatic residence of an Ethan Royal through an unsecured ventilation channel at 1:30 station time with molecular-edged weapons and powered blade technology. My operational authority is not what I'm thinking about right now. Vethasara was very still. Then the text came, "Show me the ventilation channel." I showed them the channel. I showed them the grill, the marks on it that showed it had been accessed from the outside, which meant it had been accessed from somewhere in the station's maintenance network, which meant someone with maintenance access had prepared it. I showed them the equipment I'd stripped from the 3 individuals before securing them, the electronic suite on the 2nd attacker, the communication relay on the 3rd, the powered blade technology that was not standard commercial issue. The investigative unit worked fast. By the time they were done with the preliminary scan, 2 more Vethani officers had arrived with a specialist whose function I didn't learn until afterward, when Kale explained that the specialist's rank marking indicated forensic intelligence analysis, the kind used in counter-espionage work. Vethasara called me over at 4:30. The text read, "The communication relay recovered from Attacker 3 is encrypted on Vethani commercial military grade. The encryption key, MATCHES, a key registered to." The text stopped. Vethasara looked at me. It is registered to this station's administrative network, the text continued, specifically to the Protocol Liaison Office. I said, Ilya. The protocol officer is currently in her quarters. She has been informed that she is under administrative review. Not arrest. She has not yet been charged. I thought about that. She texted Vethasara's office channel when I told her about the security concern last night, I said. I watched her do it. If I were building a case, I'd start with who she texted and whether that communication was through the same secondary relay channel that the data specialist intercepted earlier. The station commander looked at me for a longer moment than any previous moment. You are a cargo dock workers defender from a minor dispute ATMARA station, came the text. How do you know how to build an espionage case? I was in the Earth Colonial Security Force for 6 years, I said. Unit 7 Ghost before the contract collapsed. Another pause. What was Unit 7 Ghost? Classified, I said, and irrelevant to the current situation. What's relevant is Ilya's communication record for the last 12 hours. I went to see the princess at 500. She was in the interior quarters, sitting on the edge of the sleeping platform with Sira standing beside her. She was an arresting configuration, what an Ethan version of a wrap or robe looked like, comfortable and informal, and the bioluminescence was at a very low level like a banked fire. She looked tired, not afraid, tired. I stood in the doorway. It's over, I said, for tonight. She looked at me, 5. 5, I said, none of them will be filing complaints. The bioluminescence pulsed that amber gold. Are you hurt? Bruised elbow, I said. I've had worse. Kale. Fine, his armor's going to need some attention. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the channel, I heard what they said about the channel, the maintenance access. Someone on the station prepared it for them, I said. Vethasara is looking into it. Ilya. That's where the evidence is pointing, I said. Vethasara hasn't made a formal finding yet. She nodded very slowly. The bioluminescence was doing the deep blue-violet again, that controlled fear I'd seen before, but it wasn't alone this time. There was amber running through it, amber and violet cycling. I didn't know the Ethan vocabulary for that combination. I still don't, entirely, but it looked like something I recognized from a human perspective. The look that comes after something dangerous has passed, and you let yourself feel how dangerous it was, now that it's safe to feel it. I said, get some rest, I'll be at the door. She said, Corporal Moss. I stopped. Thank you. I thought about a few different ways to answer that. Most of them felt wrong, too formal, too casual, too much. In the end, I said, the blade's still in one piece, I didn't lose it. A long pause, and then the bioluminescence, just the amber gold, clean and warm, no other color mixed in. Good, she said. Part 5, what came after? I'm going to compress the next 72 hours, because the archive record already contains the full investigative timeline, and it doesn't need me to repeat it. Short version, Ilya was charged. The encrypted communication on her system matched the secondary relay channel. Further analysis found 3 other communications over the preceding week that the forensic intelligence specialist linked to the same thread: preparatory messages, logistical coordinates, timing sequences. The maintenance access for the ventilation channel had been granted to a station technician who turned out to be employed under a secondary contract with Vethani Logistics and Security combined. The Vethani Commerce Directorate's lead negotiating official, a senior figure named Vethkorin, who had been conducting the trade agreement talks with the Ethan delegation at a separate location in the station complex, was found to have held an encrypted consultation with a Vethani Logistics executive 48 hours before the attack. The trade agreement talks collapsed. Not because the Ethan side walked away, the princess stayed, which I think surprised a lot of people, including some on her own side. She stayed and she issued a formal communication through the Galactic Diplomatic Archive that laid out, in precise and documented detail, the chain of events, the investigative findings, and what she described, in language that I've been told, is considered extremely blunt for Ethan diplomatic communication, as the use of violence as a commercial negotiating tool by parties whose authority derives from the very trade protocols they have violated. The Vethani Commerce Directorate issued a formal apology to the Ethan Sovereign Compact.